Hey everyone, it's Reed. Before we get started, I just want to say please listen closely to my conversation with Dr. Francis Fukuyama. He is one of the most esteemed political scientists and philosophers in recent American history. I am beyond flattered to have had the opportunity to talk to him, and I think he helps us explore a lot of the issues we're dealing with today in a way that is both actionable and optimistic. And now, on with the show. Welcome back to the home front. I'm your host, Reed Galen. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Francis Fukuyama, the Olivier Nomelini Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He's also a faculty member of FSI's Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. He is also director of Stanford's Ford Dorsey Masters in International Policy and a professor by courtesy of political science. Dr. Fukuyama has written widely on issues in development and international politics. His latest book, Liberalism and Its Discontents, was published in May 2022 and is available wherever fine books are sold. Today, he's coming to us from Stanford, California. Professor, welcome.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me.
So the reason why I asked you to come on was some of your colleagues at the National Endowment for Democracy sent me the latest edition of the Journal of Democracy, and there you have a piece called Delivering for Democracy and Why Results Matter. And this was one that I have been thinking about since last fall when I was traveling the country, was when I went to some frankly rougher neighborhoods, sir. I saw that a lot of people were disenchanted, disengaged, and my sense was that I was out there carrying the banner for democracy, but that for the people I was speaking with, that democracy hadn't delivered, and that it hadn't delivered recognition, as you talk about in your seminal work. As Hegel described it, it wasn't providing economic stability. It wasn't providing anything that they could personally take hold of. So give us a sense of what you mean by delivering for democracy. Is it simply economic benefit? Is it simply infrastructure? Or is there something broader to it?
Well, I think that the reason that governments exist is that there are certain collective goods that people in a society want. And that's a lot of different things. It begins with physical security. So you want to be able to walk down the street and not be robbed or attacked. You want to have a lot of economic opportunities so that you and your family can prosper. You want to have certain social services. The garbage needs to be collected. Things like infrastructure matter as well. We tend to take these for granted in a country like the United States, but I think that what we've been witnessing over the past couple of decades is a slow deterioration in the quality of a lot of those services. And I think that this is one of the reasons why people are unhappy and believe that nothing seems to be working. I mean, there's a lot of examples of this. We were here in California, we were promised high speed rail 2 decades ago. And at the moment, they built a little segment between like Merced and Fresno where nobody actually is going to get on the train. And there are a lot of cases where the government simply has not acted in a way that is visible to people. And I think that's one of the sources of populism and discontent in the country right now.
Well, as someone who actually helped pass the ballot measure back in 2008 for high-speed rail when I lived in California, and we were subsequently going to do the public relations work for it, which we didn't end up doing. That's been sort of the white whale of California infrastructure for many, many years. But what you're describing there sounds a little bit like the sort of abundance agenda that the Ezra Kleins of the world are talking about. Is that sort of in line with what you're thinking, or is there a broader issue at work?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I'm 100% on board with Ezra and the abundance movement. I mean, I think that his argument is a very cogent one that although, conservatives famously don't like government or are constantly criticizing it, his argument is that liberals and progressives have contributed to the failure of government because they have focused excessively on procedures and rules and regulations that make it increasingly difficult for the government to actually do anything. And so if you ask, why is it that high-speed rail doesn't exist today? There's zoning and permitting requirements. We in California have something called the California Environmental Quality Act that allows all 40 million citizens of California to sue anything they want with no statute of limitations. And as a result, you have a lot of veto points built into the way we make decisions and very little to force something that's in the collective interest, like high-speed rail between Los Angeles and San Francisco. And I think that it's not just a problem in this country. One of the big phenomena is going on in El Salvador. I'm not talking about the Trump administration sending deportees there. I mean, I don't like that, but that's not the main issue. The problem in El Salvador had just been an impossibly high crime rate because of the gangs there. So they elect Nayib Bukele as president several years ago, and he basically solves the problem by jailing some very large percentage of the young men in the country without any trial, without any due process. He simply puts them in jail, on the presumption that they're gang members. Uh, but the crime rate actually drops, and he becomes a very successful and popular president by ignoring all of the things that we believers in a rule of law think is necessary. And I think that, the current administration is behaving in a very similar manner. They have done a lot of things that I think are actually illegal. The courts have complained about it, but they are operating under the same assumption that politically they'll be rewarded for this because what people care about is not adherence to legal procedures. It's actually getting things done and producing real results for citizens. I personally think that you can't solve this by violating the law, by simply acting in this autocratic manner. But you can certainly do a lot of things to make decision making easier, to make it easier to get high speed rail. This is really what Ezra Klein is talking about in abundance is just clearing away some of the underbrush that prevents the government from actually doing things.
We talked about that, and in that book is, the idea that red states build housing faster or more of it. And okay, there are a lot of statistics to bear that out. Okay. Again, the people that I met, on the ground, they had houses, doctor. It wasn't a matter that they had houses, is that they had little else. They had a house in a rough neighborhood, a job that didn't pay enough, a completely dismantled or non-existent safety net, no assurance of tomorrow, let alone next year. And so the idea of additional housing, I get it. The idea of high-speed rail, which, in a pipe dream, look, Southwest is just as easy to take from LAX to Burbank to SFO to San Jose to Oakland, wherever it is. There are plenty of options other than high speed rail. It wasn't as if people can't get up I-5 or up the 101. So how do you get to those people not that live in major metropolitan areas or already have a sense of I'd like this to be easier, but how do you get to the people for whom like high speed rail would be fine, but it wouldn't change the nature of how they live or how frankly they see the government?
Well, I wasn't mentioning high-speed rail because I think that that's the critical thing that needs to be done in California or in the country. It's just an example of why there's a perception that things simply don't work and things don't happen. I think that, there are other goods, economic growth, job opportunities, healthcare, uh, good education, schools that will actually educate your children. Government's responsible for all of those things, and I think that it varies from one part of the country to another which of these is lacking, but I think that an effective government is one that not only obeys the law and stays within the boundaries of law, but is also able to deliver a whole bunch of different kinds of public goods to citizens. So high-speed rail is just one illustration, but in other places, it could be security. There are many places in the United States that are terrorized by high rates of crime. There are certainly a lot of schooling that is not getting done because of problems in the public school system. So there's a whole range of things, positive outcomes that governments are expected to deliver that I think are not being delivered in the United States today.
You write, critics of democracy must acknowledge a fundamental, definite distinction between democratic and authoritarian rule, the rule of voters in democracy to hold leaders accountable. In a weird way, do you think that the voters in the United States were holding American democracy accountable, perhaps by electing someone like a Donald Trump who promised to quote unquote get things done, even though the things that are being done might be betraying the ethos of the United States, flat out breaking the law, or only advantaging a certain small portion of the population over others?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that one of the big problems with the overregulation of the society that makes it very hard to do things is precisely that it stimulates people to vote for someone like Trump, who promises that he's going to fix things, or Elon Musk, is another example of that. People perceive the government's not working, so you get somebody that knows nothing about how the government actually works, who just arbitrarily starts firing people, including a lot of people that are actually necessary to keep things working, out of this general feeling that, we gotta shake up the system. It would be far preferable to try to go after a reform that was targeted, that actually understood, the importance of government, why the government needs to do certain things, why it's actually lacking in capacity and needs more people rather than fewer, but, where you can actually make changes that will, help things. I started a group last year, several months before the election, to try to outline what that kind of an agenda would actually look like. Because I agree that the government is not working in many respects, but I think that you have to have a sensible reform agenda that actually understands what the underlying problem is. And, that's something we're trying to do because I think that the current assault on the government by the Trump administration eventually is gonna run out of steam. People are gonna realize they went too far. They're not just cutting fat, they're cutting a lot of the meat, and things are not gonna work any better. And in anticipation of that moment, we've got an agenda.
Listen, we don't know where the Trump administration will take us in the next 3.5 years, or its advocates in both the judiciary and the U.S. Congress, and frankly, within the states as well. So, how do you create a situation where you're providing a governing vision, a moral governing vision and philosophy that does not appear as just technocratic and nibbling around the edges? How do you bring people, as you wrote in your book, how do you bring people back to the idea that democracy has to make a case for itself?
Well, that's why I think that I like something like the abundance agenda because it's very specific in terms of a vision of what the United States could look like. You could actually build your way towards, a low carbon future. You could actually provide, broadband internet really to all of the rural communities in the United States. That's another, recent failure where the Biden administration appropriated something like $40 billion to extend broadband internet to rural America. By the time they left office, they had not connected a single a single customer, right? And so I think that there's a vision there for technological transformation of the sort that happened during the progressive era, and during the New Deal. In the first 3 years of the Roosevelt administration after the election of 1932, they built Hoover Dam, they built the Oakland Bay Bridge, and they built the Golden Gate Bridge, right? They electrified the Tennessee Valley under the TVA. So I think there's a lot of positive things that would be very visible to people that could be done, if people had a different attitude towards the government. They didn't see the government simply as a threat, but they saw it as something that could actually help them accomplish, common ends. And I think it's that kind of vision that's, waiting to be articulated by somebody.
Let me ask that because obviously we're not operating in a vacuum. I mean, many of us get to live in bubbles of our own creation more than any of us probably ever thought we could, but we are not operating in a situation where the playing field is A, even, or B, that the opponent is, I like to say, not to make light of it, Professor, that we play chess and Trump eats the pieces. And so, how do we combat that? Or is it simply that, and I say this because I think it's an amoral thing. I don't believe that we should let the country burn in the hopes that we can rise like a phoenix. So, how do you combat that? Because let's just talk about education for a moment. Education is, there's that expression, and you've been an educator for many years, right? It's the one thing people can't take away from you. No one can take away your education, but we as a country and both as a culture have diminished the importance of it. And we are now seeing the results of that. So, how do we tell people, no, your kids got to learn? Like, defunding public schools on some ideological insanity is only hurting you when, the thing that we see is like people like, oh, I'm voting against my own interest. It's not my own interest. I'm mad at you. And that's enough for me right now.
I think there's two parts to the agenda. So The first is to use our existing checks and balances to stop this kind of destructive activity. So there's now, probably over 200 lawsuits against different executive orders that the Trump administration has issued since January 20th. The recent thing with trying to ban international students from attending Harvard has already been stopped by a judge. So there's a lot of legal work, and I think that the courts are the first line of defense. The second and bigger line of defense is actually voting. So we're going to have a midterm election next year. If the tariffs and this kind of crazy economic policy that Trump wants to enact actually is put in place, I think the economy is going to be in terrible shape in another year. And that may be a stimulus to people actually voting, let's say recapture the House of Representatives for the Democrats. So there'll be some action there. So that's the short term defensive agenda. But I think that you can't simply play defense and expect to win the longer game. And I think that's the thing that the Democrats are struggling with right now is that they have not articulated a positive vision for what the country would look like if they return to power. And I think they got to do that. And that's why I think the abundance agenda or something like it is very important. One of my favorite Democratic politicians right now is Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, because he actually did something like what Ezra is suggesting. When I-95 was closed because of that tanker truck accident a couple of years ago, he was told that it would take 6 months to get the permits, in place to fix it, and he did it in 2 weeks, because of its importance, to the economy of Eastern Pennsylvania, and he did it by, skirting some of the rules that had been put in place. If you systematize that and said, "Look, we've just got too many things that block us from building affordable housing, from fixing our schools, from increasing security in bad neighborhoods." I think that that would be a positive agenda that is the only way in the end that you're going to beat the kind of populists that are currently, doing their destructive work.
I was it like 10 years ago, maybe even longer, Professor. Remember I-580 in the Bay Area? Remember the tanker truck overturned and like the highway actually melted. And I believe they rebuilt that in a matter of weeks as well. They had a steel factory that was creating these beams. They did it in a day's notice. They had special jets. So it is possible, right? Those things are possible.
It's possible, but the thing is that, you can't depend on disasters to drive this process forward. You have to make it easy for people to accomplish things on a routine basis and not just have these special workarounds that are driven by an act of God. And I think that that's the kind of vision for the country that, somebody needs to articulate. It doesn't have to be a Democrat. I mean, you could have actually a bipartisan coalition of people in Congress that would support, this kind of reform. And I think that that's very important to be able to say what that actually looks like.
You mentioned FDR. In your piece, you mentioned President Eisenhower with the interstate highway system. Obviously, we have President Kennedy. They accomplished big things. You can make an argument that LBJ followed on in Kennedy's stead, but they were three people who like had big visions and they got big things done. Is that possible now? Do you think that the level of political entrenchment, and I'm not bashing just Republicans or Democrats, but just the kind of people you talk about in your piece, which are these very well funded groups who come in usually to stop something, not encourage something. Are we able to pass through that? Are we able to say, you are a well funded elite organization? You have had your say. You don't get to speak for us simply because you have more money.
That's what politics is all about. You can defeat these kinds of forces if you create a countervailing force. It's all about power. So you need a politician or a leader that can create a coalition. How do you create a coalition? Well, first of all, you've got to articulate your vision of what you want to do. And you got to make that clear to people, and you've got to say it in simple words that make it very understandable. This is actually what Donald Trump was really brilliant at. I mean, I think most of his ideas were crackpot, but, he repeated them over and over, and people understood that. And so you need a progressive person to articulate what would a progressive America look like and how would that benefit you. You've got to attract not just people that are ideologically committed to, a particular uh, view of America. You need a broad coalition because we're a very heavily polarized and divided country, and unless you are able to attract, the more moderate people from the other side, you're also not going to succeed. And so it's really a matter of just plain old-fashioned political leadership that creates these kinds of coalitions. I think it's completely possible to counteract the oligarchs on the other side. This is what happened at the end of the 19th century under people like Theodore Roosevelt. You had the Standard Oil Trust, and you had these big banks, and against that backdrop, they created the antitrust system. The Sherman and Clayton Acts were passed in the face of, tremendously concentrated wealth back then. So I don't see any reason in theory why you can't do that in the future. I do think the degree of concentration is really pretty extraordinary right now. You've got like 5 individuals that were all President Trump's inauguration that, together represent a pretty significant chunk of American GDP. And so the hill that you need to climb is pretty high right now. But that's what politics is about. That's why you need leadership.
Something else you wrote in your piece, it said, quote, although previous waves of democratization may have tapped into citizens' hearts and minds through enfranchisement and unprecedented acquisition of new rights, these vehicles of legitimacy have potentially reached their limit. In performing democracy, citizens increasingly show dissatisfaction with the political system by turning out infrequently at elections, protesting and supporting any institutional and even openly anti-democratic candidates at the polls. That's what we talked about with Donald Trump. And I say this not to diminish someone's belief system, but just as a matter of electoral politics. If we believe that 25% of the country, for argument's sake, believes that what Donald Trump is doing is good, right? Then how do we start to bring along not only those non-Trumpy people, and I'm not asking you a political strategy question, I'm asking you a philosophical question, but also so many of those people in the 2022 midterms, 56% of eligible voters did not participate. In 2024, 71% of races were unopposed. Neither the Republicans nor the Democrats put someone up. So how do we plant the seeds? Because I think this is another part, because you've been studying this for so long, is that what the outcome you want now is not a bumper sticker. It's not a red hat. It's not a television commercial. So how do we start to really weave together these different threads of how all of this can ultimately work together?
Well, that's why I think you need to start disaggregating, different classes of voters. So I think the MAGA base in the United States is 25, 30% of the electorate. They're not enough to by themselves win an election. And a lot of people are much more movable than that. The whole contest in the last several elections is for that middle. And that means that the Democratic Party has got, an important choice. Some of them are convinced that the reason that they lost the last election was that they weren't left wing enough. I just don't see any evidence for that. It seems to me that if you're actually going to broaden your coalition and win back some of the people that had voted for Biden in 2020, but then voted for Trump in 2024, you're going to have to do things that would appeal to them. And that's where a concrete positive vision comes in, because I do think that you could attract people, through articulating what America could look like if we took the right steps to facilitate a return to the kind of constructive agenda that, prevailed in earlier generations.
Well, and I think it's ironic too, Professor, because it's not just the independent or swing voters, as we call them. I believe that there's a lot of base Democratic voters who stayed home because they haven't seen that from their own party as well.
No, that's right. This is why I think that a strategy that simply is oppositional, that I mean, look, Donald Trump needs to be called out because he's been an illegal president that seems to have no understanding of or loyalty to the Constitution. So that's bad, and we got to say that that's bad. But I think that by itself, that's not gonna be enough to convince exactly those kinds of audiences that you just mentioned. You know, a lot of the vote in 2024 was not for Donald Trump. I mean, these people were not voting for high tariffs on Vietnam or, whatever. They just didn't like the Democrats, and they didn't think that the Democrats really had an agenda that aligned with their interest. And that's why I think in order to get them to actually show up to vote, you've got to explain, how you are going to produce concrete changes that will improve their lives.
Do you believe that what you've spoken of over the last 20, 30 years, are we, in your mind, philosophically in an anti-establishment, anti-status quo era where no matter what, if regardless of what letter you have behind your name, you need to be someone who is saying, what we have done is not working. We must do something different. Because to your point, I feel like there are a lot of status quo Democrats, right? The system they believe broadly works. They would like it to work marginally better. But just as a political person, that's not, no one's buying that, or at least not enough people are buying it.
Well, that's why actually I think we may have an extraordinary opportunity. My group had two alternative plans. We wanted to protect the federal government in case the Republicans won, but we also wanted to reform it in case the Democrats won. And quite frankly, if Harris had won the election last November, we'd have very few opportunities to really do a kind of reform of the bureaucracy that, we thought would be necessary because there's too many entrenched interest groups that really didn't want to upset the status quo. And that's why there's just a possibility that, between Donald Trump and Elon Musk and the people, running this administration, it might scare people enough. It might clear away some of the entrenched interests that have been blocking, a real change. And then, that then opens up the opportunity for doing a sensible reform in the US government. Now, it could be that it's not going to happen or it won't happen for a while because the reaction to Trump is actually going to drive the Democratic Party far to the left. And, just like Jeremy Corbyn, head of the British Labour Party in one election after the Conservatives had failed. But I think eventually you're going to get to the point where people are going to want to say, okay, we're going to give you a chance to govern again, but you got to tell us exactly what that means because we can't see it. And what we've seen from past performance doesn't look good. This could begin on a state level. One of the things, so I am a registered Democrat, I vote Democratic, but I have to admit, these blue cities on the West Coast and then in places like New York, New Jersey, they're not well governed. They're really not well governed compared to a lot of red states and a lot of red cities. And I think that, Democrats kind of have to own up to that and think about the way that they've been operating in places where they've been dominant and ask whether that's going to be an attractive model going forward.
Well, I think back to 2020, in Portland, Oregon, in particular. And I think that what you're talking about there was a political failure and a governmental failure that ultimately had really long-lasting consequences to this moment, which was the mayor there refused to take control of a spiraling situation. The governor refused to do the same. I think about there were a bunch of guys that pick up trucks with MAGA flags who were crossing the bridges, right? There's 4 or 5 bridges that go into Portland. In my mind, not being a mayor, not being a governor, I would have deployed the National Guard with a couple of Humvees and 50 caliber machine guns and said, "You're not coming here. I don't know where you're going, but you're not coming here." And I would have said the same thing to anybody lighting anything on fire. Like at last call at a bar, not to make it too pedestrian. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. And I think oftentimes that unwillingness to make hard decisions because you might upset someone prevents anything from happening because it's, well, what if these people don't like me? Governance is not necessarily about being liked. If you govern correctly, then people will like you. If you govern badly, people will not like you. And now I have to assume, although I don't have the figures in front of me, Professor, that Portland is a place that's probably struggling 5 years on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So that's really the point of the article that we started discussing is that, people want good governance, and that doesn't involve hard decisions and making choices, between different alternatives. And I think that A lot of progressive cities have really failed in that. I mean, part of it is also conceptual. I think that defund the police has to be the dumbest political slogan ever invented by anybody, both as a substantive policy, but also as something that would appeal to the kind of voters you're going to need to stay in power. And so all of these are mistakes I think that, the Democrats have to own up to if they're ever going to regain power.
You wrote something at the beginning of the end of history about the idea that at the end of the Soviet Union, the people who were in place, alongside Gorbachev were also the people who understood the nature of how to make change. Obviously, we're in a very different place from the end of the Soviet Union, but we need to find those people who understand the system well enough and who are willing to be clear eyed enough as to say, okay, what is it we're going to do here? Because my concern, Professor, is that if we don't, then if there is no countervailing force, as you've called it, and I use that expression a lot myself, something worse will come along because the desire and the leaning toward action will become what people look for. Well, at least they're doing something. You people don't do anything.
This has really guided my own teaching over the last few years because I think that, a lot of the elites in the United States are trained to think about policy and that the main thing is just to articulate the right policy. And if they can do that, then they've done their job. They don't actually pay attention to the implementation of policies. And that's where they fall down. Implementation is really the hard work, of governing, because you have to build a coalition, you have to overcome entrenched interests that want to stop you from doing what you're doing. You have to be able to communicate with people to have them join your coalition, to convince people that are neutral or don't really care that they ought to care. And we don't teach this to our students. We just say, okay, just go to law school and come up with the right words that you can write into the law, but let's not worry about how you implement that law and how you actually turn it into a reality. So I think that there's a lot of rethinking that needs to be done in terms of what it means to govern, and I think that regarding the implementers of policies as lower level individuals that you just hire a contractor to implement the policy. This is not the right way to think about things.
I think that's right, but also does that speak to and throughout your research and throughout even history, I mean, is it unusual to have an entrenched and ultimately disconnected political class? It would not seem to be this is the first time we've had this problem.
No, no, I mean, I think this is something that's occurred repeatedly in human history where you get a ruling elite. They get to rule because they were successful in an early period. But as time goes on, they think that they're entitled to rule. They rule by certain procedures that then become, rigid, and the society around them changes, and they fail to appreciate those changes, and they fail to change the way that they act. This is a phenomenon my mentor, Samuel Huntington, called political decay, and, I wrote a 2 volume series really, covering the whole span of human history where I said that actually achieving a modern state is an actually fairly rare achievement. And one of the reasons it's rare is that you go backwards periodically. You create modern institutions and then they become too rigid. They don't adapt to changing circumstances. People get tired of them and then the whole thing collapses. And I think America is going through a moment like that, where at one point it did have pretty functional institutions, but they're increasingly not working. And unless, the people that run those institutions are willing to make big changes, they're not going to survive.
I was listening to another interview you had done, and you talked about the idea that perhaps you were leaning towards being a social democrat now. I was fascinated by this. Give us a sense of how you came to this place, because I am someone, Professor, who started. I spent my life in Republican politics up until about 10 years ago. I grew up in Republican politics in Washington D.C., and I would venture to say I've had a pretty significant political evolution over the last decade. Although, as my dad said, we were always sort of Trotskyite Republicans. We were never really dyed in the wool. So, give us a sense of if you have your own political evolution, philosophical evolution, as it were.
So I was a Republican at the beginning of my career. I was a political appointee in the first Reagan administration in the State Department. I was never fully on board because actually, when I was growing up, I came from a Democratic family, but I sort of made the conversion when I was in college. But I would say that what really shifted me to the left was the experience of the first decade of the 21st century. And there were two things in particular that were key moments. The first was the Iraq War, and the second was the financial crisis of 2008. Both of those events were disasters that we are still paying the price for, and they were directly the result of certain conservative ideas. The first one was this neoconservative conceit that you could use, hard military power to bring about massive political change in a distant, culturally very different part of the world, which turned out to be completely wrong. And the second, the financial crisis was, I think, the direct product of certain libertarian ideas that financial markets, could be self-regulating and the government was just getting in the way by trying to reduce the risks that banks, and large financial institutions could take. And that led to another disaster. Uh, and it seems to me that, when you have a certain set of ideas that lead to big disasters, you have to be honest with yourself and say, well, maybe it wasn't just, the way they were implemented or we didn't spin things right. Maybe the ideas themselves were fundamentally wrong. And I think they were fundamentally wrong in both of those cases. The other thing is just, studying the rest of the world. It seems to me that the most successful democratic moments were ones that in which social democratic principles prevail, because I think that if you leave capitalist markets to themselves with very minimal regulation, you end up with increasing levels of inequality. And if you don't use the political system to address some of those inequalities, you're going to eventually get into a revolutionary situation where the whole thing collapses. And therefore, the successful periods in the history of the modern world were those years after World War II, where both the United States and most European countries were basically building some, moderate form of social democracy. By the 1970s, I think those got a little bit sclerotic and rigid as well. So then you had the Reagan Revolution. But if you hadn't put in place some basic social protections, Social Security, in our case, eventually universal health care. Most other democracies had done that generations earlier than we did. But, these are really necessary to maintain the legitimacy of a democratic capitalist society.
And let me go back to the disasters of the early 2000s. One I always include in the middle there is Hurricane Katrina. I actually made it to New Orleans 24 hours after landfall, and a complete and utter failure at the state, local, and federal level. And sitting in some of these meetings, Professor, watching, and she has since passed away, so I don't want to besmirch her reputation too much, but Governor Blanco completely locked it. She could not figure out what to do next. Ray Nagin, the mayor of New Orleans, literally hiding in the 38th floor of a Hyatt hotel or whatever. And then the administration, which I worked for many years, right, being unwilling to take the step of saying we have to federalize the guard or we have to do this. And let me just tell you, I tried personally to get 500 people out of the Astrodome to Shreveport, Louisiana, because I had been in touch with a pastor there who had families who were willing to take 500 people out of the Astrodome. And the people at FEMA, which I did work for and I still believe has a necessary role, refused to give me the money for the buses, right? And that to me is one of those things that sticks with me is like these people are stuck in an empty stadium. They have people that want to take them in and you won't do it because of process A, process B. But I want to get up to that other part too, which is it possible for the human mind or for us collectively to see that what we're doing is occurring on a rolling basis, which we must always understand that the maintenance is hugely important to this. And let's put it in the context of a building that occasionally you're going to have to completely replace the plumbing system. And there's a very good chance that the plumbing system you replace it with will be more efficient. It might cost some, but it's better than hoping to God that the whole thing doesn't collapse.
No, you're absolutely right. And, this is a problem with democratic politics. The politicians love to do the ribbon cutting on the new building. They don't like paying for the renovation, 10, 15 years later. That's one of those liabilities of living in a democracy. You do have a certain short-term perspective, and that's why I think for good government, you actually need deeper structures that are able to carry on work over a longer period of time and are not so subject to, short-term electoral calculations.
Does that go part and parcel of what you have mentioned in some of your writing? And I know that Ann Applebaum and Tim Snyder have written more on the authoritarian side, which is it's also very difficult to do those things until and unless you can have a common argument, until we as a populace agree these are the things that matter to us, and that we have a single source of, I hate to use this word because I think it's over, a single source of truth, that we all agree on certain basic facts.
That's a problem that I don't whose solution I don't really know because I think the internet has really screwed up that whole consensual basis of just factual empirical information. We didn't worry about questions like who won the last election or is this vaccine safe in earlier years because we trusted the authority of certain institutions that certified things. And then with the introduction of the internet, where anyone can say anything, that's exactly what happened. And instead of using this as a way of getting good factual information to people, it became a weapon that could be used to undermine the positions of your political rivals. And quite honestly, I'm not sure I see a way out of this at the moment.
How do we explain to those people that do care that, again, it took us a while to get here? It will take us a while to get out, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't do something in the meantime.
I think it's really important to give people an optimism that they have agency over their lives, and that, one of the great advantages of living in a liberal democracy is that you can exercise agency. I think the primary way you do it is by voting, but, there's other forms of political participation and engagement that are also important and effective. And I think people have to be constantly reminded that they're not, just hapless pawns, being moved on a chessboard by somebody else, but they actually can make decisions on their own. That's certainly the message that I try to give my students because hopefully they're going to end up being leaders of, a future world.
How do your students see the world? How do these young men and women, an incredibly important, fabulous, esteemed institution, how are they seeing the world that they will inherit?
Right now, they are very worried. In my program, it's an international policy program, but probably 40% of our students are not American. And here's an administration that basically just turned on Harvard and said that no non-American could attend Harvard University. So they're scared. I mean, this is a development that affects them personally on a very, very immediate basis. It's kind of unprecedented. I never would have imagined that we'd be in this kind of a situation where the country would turn in this authoritarian, nasty, resentful, angry direction. But that's where we are. And I think, the students are caught in the middle of this and they're frightened by it.
And as you've noted, and I think other people have too, authoritarianism is always in its own way homegrown. It has similar tactics, it has similar beliefs, but it all stems from something very native to wherever it grows. All right. Professor, first and foremost, thank you so much for joining me. I cannot be more appreciative of your time. I know that you're writing books and you're continually talking, but are there places that folks can find your work or listen to you on a regular basis?
Well, thanks for asking. I have a blog. It's on Substack, but it's part of Persuasion, an online journal. And I helped us found another online magazine called American Purpose, which merged with Persuasion over a year ago. And I have a blog there. I've also got a YouTube channel. They're all titled Frankly Fukuyama. So if you simply search for them, you'll get to them.
Well, I certainly appreciate it, sir. As always, everyone, you can find me on social media at Reed Galen or at Reed_Galen USA. I also have a Substack at the home front. Francis Fukuyama, thank you for joining me.
Thanks very much for having me.
Everyone else, I'll see you next time.